Okay, so as I said before, you're very welcome to the first of our Irish Studies research seminars online this semester. We have a full program coming up between now and May, so do look at our web pages if you want to see what else is going to come up over the next few months. We're meeting generally at on Monday afternoons at 4:30 p.m. Irish time. This afternoon, it's a tremendous pleasure for me to welcome our speaker this afternoon, who is Professor Nicholas Allen from the University of Georgia. Nicholas is well known, I'm sure, to many people in the meeting this afternoon. He's the director of the Wilson Center for the Humanities and Arts at the University of Georgia, and a professor in humanities in the university. He's published very widely on Irish history, Irish culture and cultural history, and Irish literature, including books on George Russell, A.E., and on Ernie O'Malley. He's been the Burns Library visiting scholar at Boston College, and has received research awards from a number of bodies, including the Mellon Foundation, the National Endowment for the Humanities, and the Irish Research Council. And as I'm sure many of you are already aware, his most recent book, Ireland, Literature and the Coast, Sea Tangled, was published by Oxford University Press in 2020. And it's on a topic related to his research on the Irish coast that Nick is going to talk to us about this afternoon. He's going to trace some of the cultural histories of the north of Ireland in literature, with a view to exploring the diasporic and extraterritorial dimensions of the islands of Ireland as they relate to further maritime archipelagos. And the title of his talk this afternoon is North of Ireland, Literature, History and the Archipelago. Now, I'm just going to bring up Nick's slides on screen, and he's going to tell me when to move them on. So as soon as we have those ready, then we'll begin.
Thanks, Peter. Can everyone hear me okay? Thumbs up. Okay, well, it's lovely to be with you all. Peter today is going to be Debbie McGee to my Paul Daniel. So if you hear me calling Peter's name out for the next slide. I just wanted to start by with some thanks. Thank you, Peter, and to Queen's for having me back. I'm a graduate with 2 degrees at the Queen's University of Belfast and very proud to do so. I see some of the great scholars of Ireland and of Belfast. I see Professor Connolly has joined us on the call here today, or in this conversation, and much of the conversation today will be actually about the city of Belfast and some of the ways that we might think about it in literature and culture. I wanted to thank all of you for being here. I appreciate that having another online meeting mightn't be the most desirous thing when we would all like to see each other in person, and that we're all separated, so many of us, from our families and our relatives and our loved ones. And I just wanted to say that we are still a community here together, and I appreciate your being here in this time of pandemic, and I hope that you and your friends and your loved ones are all well. I wanted to thank particularly my friends in Athens, who always come along and support me and are such good community and company in all the things that we do. And just I wanted to share also that one of the people I graduated from Trinity College in Dublin, Anne-Marie Darcy, is at the University of Leicester at the moment, where her position is under some threat due to reorganisation that has nothing to do with her scholarly brilliance. And if you had time afterwards today and you enjoyed what I had to say, perhaps you'd do me a slight return by going and looking at the University of Leicester and Anne-Marie Darcy and thinking about how you might contribute to the various petitions that are going around to secure her future. So it's lovely to be with you all. And when I thought about being at Queen's, and I'm going to talk to you about my book, which has just been published, and I'll do it in the broadest sense, with a conversation I hope that you'll enjoy about literature, about visual art, a little bit about cultural history. I think often of Michael Allen. Whenever I was at Queen's, really, there was one person who made all the difference to me. He used to bring me up to his office while he would eat sandwiches and look at me wryly as I expounded on my various thoughts on Irish literature. But he read carefully, he paid attention, and he was generous when he didn't need to be. And he was generous even whenever I didn't realise I needed that kind of support and encouragement. So just in starting, I wanted to remember Michael, who was such a great presence for me, in this little poem that Michael Longley, who also loved him dearly, wrote for him. We looked after poets after a fashion, And you who over the decades in the Crown, the Eglantine, the Bott, the Welly, the Chelsea have washed down poetry and pottage without splashing a page and scanned for life-threatening affectation my latest wee poem, You Have Looked After Me. There was a great tradition of mentorship through Michael in Queen's, and I will forever be grateful for it. Peter, could we move on, please? And Peter, if you can hear me, would you put on the next slide? Thanks. So what I'm going to talk to you about today in general, and of course the title North of Ireland, thinking about the north of Ireland, Northern Ireland, these contested states. I don't need to tell you about how complicated the border of Ireland has been over the last century. I don't need to tell you how fraught the commemoration of a centenary of the state of Northern Ireland will be. I don't need to tell you, Garrett Carr's brilliant book, The Lie of the Land, has already shown it, how complicated it has been to create a border in the island of Ireland whenever it comes to the sea. The legal line in Lough Foyle, I believe, has still never been quite agreed. I might need to remind you, however, I'm 48 years old now. I grew up in Belfast during the Troubles. The docks in the harbour were a kind of distant place to me. They weren't a place that you could go. When I used to take the bus in from East Belfast to go to school in Inst, the only kind of presence I had at the docks were in stories of my family. One of my grandfathers worked in the shipyard in a kind of itinerant fashion. It was the sound of the klaxon going off for the end of the small shifts that were left. And of course, I used to go and watch Glentoran in the Oval, and you would have the cranes, which are still there. So it was sort of there as an imprint, but the actual watery history of the city was something which I think diminished in the later 20th century and around the Troubles. I think too, in the course of Irish history over the 20th century, the idea of a territorial-based nationalism, or the idea of a landmass, of a divided island, was something which took the critical conversation in literature, at least, away from water and the sea. There has been a turn, I think, in the last 20 years towards the blue humanities, and now even more recently towards the coastal humanities, and thinking about what it means to think about territoriality, about place, about identity, about representation. Whenever you're thinking of it in a location, in a cultural geography where you have many different things happening at once, turning over in the tide. And the great example of that, if you're reading James Joyce's Portrait of the Artist, from which the title of my book is adapted, in all modesty, whenever Stephen is walking along the beach and he sees these sea tangles, with these little bits of seaweed that he sees, which are changing colour in the water as they turn. And it's one of those moments where he begins to think that he might have a life outside Ireland, or that Ireland might offer him a life more complex than the one of church and school that he had previously been afforded. And it's a moment actually of his approaching moment of vision and of seeing in a way that opens up a new aesthetic idea to him. So one of the things I'm going to do at the start of the talk today, just briefly, is to run through some of the other ways in which the historical mapping of the island of Ireland and the idea of the north and northerliness is something I'll come back to, has always been a little watery, a little liquid, a little uncertain. But to take it one step further, not just to make the historical case, but to suggest the aesthetic one. So if we admit a liquidity, a transparency, a motion of water, think about the end of the dead. Whenever we have this cycle of water frozen into snow, a sense of death as being a passage of the water cycle. If we think of water as itself being a medium and a motive, could we then adjust or think again about the conditions of the coastline as a new aesthetic way of thinking about our contemporary moment, and also a way of inaugurating the future? I was asked just before we started who was behind me. It's George Russell, the Lurgan-born writer. Spent much of his life in Dublin. But that visionary tradition of Irish literature has always been very strong in Yeats and Russell in the revival. But it comes up in very surprising ways whenever you begin to look at the coast and water as you go through the 20th and now into the 21st century. And that's really something I'd like to talk to you about. What does reading water look like? What is the weather? What is the light of the coast? Are they given natural things that we're simply observing, or do they, within their fabrics and structures, in their tones, in their suggestions, point to a different way of ordering the world that might call other worlds into being? And as I go through the talk, I'll get to talk about the magazine Archipelago. Will be coming to an end then. But I want to finish off with Anna Burns' great book, her Ulysses of Belfast, Milkman, and show you how, if we can follow this genealogy of light and water, of vision and possibility through the 20th and 21st centuries, that the books that we read now, that we might think exist within one literary canon actually have lots of apertures and connections and windows into other ways of seeing that we might other miss. And just to keep this image in your head as we go along, it's one of Donald Teskey's beautiful paintings. It's the cover of the book, Still Horizon 2. And just to keep that idea of light, water, land, rock in constant motion. Peter, could we go on, please? So the idea of the islands of Britain and Ireland as being interconnected, but always in need of mapping, always in need of a certain kind of unitary logic, is something that goes back all the way through the historiography. If there are any early modern scholars here, anything I say will be obvious to them and long since discovered, which is that water transits were the source of connection between Ireland and these other islands for such a long time. That water has been something that divides us, but also has asked various kinds of political philosophy to think of ways to make a logical conversation by which a union might be discovered. This is a really fascinating book for those of you who are stuck studying online, A Short Geography of the British Islands, John Richard Green and Alice Stopford Green. Now, she wrote this book really, I think, from a unionist perspective in 1880 with her then older husband, who was also a scholar. But if you think about Alice Stopford Green later with Erskine Childers and Roger Casement plotting for the overthrow of empire in London, thinking about the importation of guns by boat, even within her life story and within her practice of historiography, this study of the islands and their logic of their being joined together is something which changed quite radically, even in the 30 or 40 years between this book and the Irish War of Independence. So it's a fascinating book, has many theories about why Ireland, Scotland and Wales need to be joined to England, maritime theories, coastal theories, and the idea of civilization being connected to the Union by closer maritime connection. And then if we go to the next one, we have Standish O'Grady's great vision of Ireland at sea. Now, the history of Ireland has been read, O'Grady's history of Ireland, as this kind of odd, peculiar, eccentric, mythic, Carlylean fantasia of Irish history that took the myths of ancient Ireland and recast them in a kind of bodily and cultural archetype that was powerful to Yeats and was its own precursor to someone like Patrick Pearse's invention of the ideal Irish heroic epic martial character at the start of the 20th century. And they've been read like that intensely and brilliantly so. But if you go along one more, Peter. At the very start of the history of Ireland, there is this version then of what the deep past used to look like. And, you know, one of the peculiarities of this eddying history is to think, as I read this, of someone like Tim Robinson much later. Now, Tim's work, and Tim might have been aghast at me comparing him to Standish O'Grady. Tim's work is based in deep science, deep history, but there is something in this chronological, in this temporal scope that is of a bearing with the deep time that the coast also invites you to think about. And it's going to come up again later whenever we think a little bit more about a writer like Hugh McDermott. In the Pleistocene epoch, the Thames, the Rhine and the Elbe were all but tributaries of a mighty river that flowed northward, draining the great plain between England and Scandinavia, over which roll now the waves of the German Ocean. Then the Liffey, running eastward, met the Mersey from England, the Clyde from Scotland, and uniting ran northward, till their combined current met the Arctic waters many miles beyond the remotest of the Isles of Ork. Such was northwestern Europe when it was first occupied by man, such the region out of which Ireland was carved. Now, part of the process of these descriptions is to give Ireland a different basis in deep historical time, that where it is now and where it may be in the future is not predicated by the kinds of popular histories that might have been there before 1878. O'Grady himself grew up in the west of Ireland, in a part of the country that was deeply affected by the famine. These ghosts and shades of Ireland's terrible history after the Act of Union are all there in this attempt, in this desire to go ever further back. Think of it perhaps next time you're able to walk around the city of Dublin. Imagine what it means to walk in the 19th century past the Museum of Natural History, which is now in the same complex as the National Library, in the same complex as the National Museum of Ireland. You have embedded in those buildings chronologies, temporalities, genealogies, histories, rivers of time. And thinking about Ireland as an island at sea, both unmoors you from that recent political history, but it also allows you to create a new set of coordinates for its future. So even though we're talking about in the Pleistocene, it's actually a kind of visionary time for the future. And what's it made of? Well, you have Ireland, you have England, you have Scotland, and then you have that northwest trajectory beyond the Isles of Shetland and Orkney, and thinking over to the German Ocean and to the northern coast of Scandinavia. It's precisely the territory that comes back later in Seamus Heaney. It's precisely the territory that Michael Longley travels in Archipelago in his magazine. And these northern curvatures of the earth, which have in the literature their own aspirations of light and weather, their own hours of light and dark, their own movements of people, their own transits, which are not those of the transits of national history, are things which come back over and over again in this archipelagic imagination. And Peter, could we go to the next one, please? A wonderful example of this, if you have read Erskine Childers' really wonderful novel, and if you're looking for a book to read in these quiet hours of the next days, The Riddle of the Sands, it was at the time a bestseller, one of those thrillers, almost a Bourne Identity or a James Bond of the early 20th century, where there is this secret plot to invade the east coast of England through the Atlantic coast of Germany, which is itself a narrow, shallow stretch of sand. So this is Childers, born in England, brought up in Ireland, ends up becoming an Irish revolutionary much later. But at this time, not too long after his own Gladstonian phase, and writing this book as a kind of warning about German armament. It's really fascinating because it ends up as being a warning about small wars, about almost kind of guerrilla tactics by boat at the end, and it sort of is a precursor to what happened when Childers, of course, brings his arms into Ireland in 1916 on the Helga, or for 1916, I should say. And one of the things in my book, if you have time to look at it afterwards, I had been very lucky to get to know Erskine Childers' great grandson, and he lent me some of the books that Childers had on the shipboard library as he sailed about, and it was really quite revealing of these representations of manliness at sea, about the idea of self-reliance, and about the way the conditions of mind that Childers was educated in by sailing were things which had a kind of revolutionary and radical effect afterwards. But for now, think about this. We're in the North Sea, we're in the shallows, in a small boat, but we're thinking really about the clash not only of continents, but of empires, German and Britain. For miles in every direction lay a desert of sand. So do you think about those sort of shallows as being described as deserts? Where do you find deserts? Well, you're thinking more somewhere further to the east, aren't you? In some other expansive empire. Only to the west was its outline broken by any vestiges of the sea it had risen from. There it was astir with crawling white filaments, nodded confusedly at one spot in the northwest, whence came a sibilant murmur like the hissing of many snakes. You think of all those S's at the end of the dead, can't you, as well? That kind of watery world that brings forth this assonantal sound. Desert, as I call it, it was not entirely featureless. Its colour varied from light fawn, where the highest levels had dried in the wind, to brown or deep violet, where it was still wet, and slate grey, where patches of mud soiled its clean bosom. One of the recurrent features of the coastal work in the period of late empire is the confusion of one place for another. Perhaps the greatest example is in James Joyce's Ulysses, whenever you have the hill of Hoth taken for the rock of Gibraltar. It is, of course, particularly a condition of Joyce's Ulysses, but it is also a common condition to so many of these works. And if you think about the practice of sailing in the late 19th and early 20th century, about the uncertainty of where you are, of what you can see. But it's an analogy to and an intensification of that imperial process, whereby the place which is possessed, which is colonized, which is lit upon by shore, is immediately translated into strangeness from itself by those who arrive. That possession is not an intensification of Britain, in this case, onto Ireland, or Britain here, even in competition with Germany, but it's a kind of layering, a kind of wave after wave after wave of association, that you're being read always into some other condition. And that to me is really this first late imperial layer that is so important later on for Belfast. And if you think of Belfast, that city made of sleech, standing on stilts, perhaps its greatest laureate. And one of the saddest things about writing this book is how many of our great artists and writers have passed away even in the last decade. But I so loved Kieran Carson. I loved his work. But think about that layering. Think about The Star Factory as being the great book of Belfast's deep 19th, 20th, early 21st century history. It's all here, or at least the practices, the aesthetic renderings, the beginnings are all here in that late 19th, early 20th century literature. And I want to give you a visual image of it next. Peter? Thank you. So this is from one of Jack Yeats's scrapbooks, which are in the National Gallery of Ireland. Jack Yeats had little to do with Belfast in the north, very much a man of the west and of the south, in Devon, out into Connemara. But think about this as a visual analogue, that kind of literary text I'm talking about. This is a scrapbook which is made from a Greek language dictionary. If I could hear you, I would ask you to guess what was across there, but since, you know, I'm becoming more and more convinced of my own voice, the more I get to talk to myself. This is a wrapper going along here from left to right of the inside of an orange box. And above, you can see a picture of John Redmond on a Home Rule stamp, sort of the last call of constitutional politics before the Irish Revolution. And beside that, you have Banbus cigarettes and of tobacco, which was grown largely around County Meath in Ireland. An Atlantic transport, an import, a plant which grows elsewhere, repackaged now with that kind of the idea of the female figure of Ireland, but lapped over by that glorious golden butterfly flowered wave of elsewhere that you have, the smell, the suggestion of that object. And looking askance slightly over it all is that reminder of the turbulent political history in Redmond. So the layering, the in and out, the irregularity of sensation, the admission of all of these other places is, I think, a connection absolutely to the idea of a maritime, a blue, or a coastal literature. And thinking about things like this, as Joyce says, by thinking about things you can understand, and by thinking about this sensational material history, you can begin to read the literature and think about this complicated past in a way that admits new perspectives, I think. And Peter, please. Hester Bloom has a wonderful way of putting it here, that planetary and oceanic shifts are invested in part in recognizing the artificiality and intellectual limitations of national, political, linguistic, physiological, or temporal boundaries in studying forms of literary and cultural influence and circulation. A fundamental premise of oceanic studies is that such recognized patterns of national and capital-based relationality dissolve in the space and time of the sea. Now, I wonder to some degree about this. Do they dissolve? If they do dissolve, I think that they can be recapitulated as a different element. I might say instead that they're held there in suspension, or that they are visible in other ways to the reflection of light in the water. But I would certainly say that history, this coastal version of the past, or at least cultural history in the literature, looks different from its coastal perspective. And thinking about the ways in which nations or nation states are unmoored, it's not that they become irrelevant, that their histories are any less powerful or motive, but it's rather, do they look different from the near offshore in than they do from standing on the shore looking out? Let's think about that question as we go along. And Peter, one of the first people to really think about this seriously, I think, was Sean O'Foylon. And the history of the little magazines, which is something I've always been fascinated by, is another way to follow this changing register, and we'll do this for a little bit now, through the 20th century. O'Foylon edited The Bell from 1940 to 1946, after which he was followed by Pater O'Donnell. And he really wanted the everyday vernacular life of Ireland to be represented in this literary journal. So it's one of the first places we have Brendan Behan writing, and it's about his experience of being in Borstal. So there's the idea of the marginalised, the voices being included. But he said, really, O'Foylon, and this is your magazine, that first editorial, I want you to write about what you know. And some of the places he mentioned, you can imagine farms and fields in the Irish literary tradition. You can see Patrick Kavanagh there. But he also asked about rivers, and he also asked about estuaries, and he also asked about boats. And the one place, the one city that O'Foylon thought that modernity registered most deeply in Ireland, where there was a most kind of complex, I shouldn't say cosmopolitanism, but the possibility of a future mix of attachments that weren't based on the old allegiances, was Belfast. And there's a really wonderful essay in one of the later Bells by, I think actually Joseph Tumilty, about Belfast street song. And it's where he follows all the traces in Belfast street slang to India, to the service of the British Army, the British Navy. And actually this also happens in Cork too, of course, that you have these traces of other places. and the language and vernacular of the city. Would you move on, Peter, please? And O'Fwylon's imagination, this is easy to look over, but O'Fwylon's imagination of Ireland as an island was as a sea-connected place. And you can imagine how much that had been brought home to him in the Bell from 1940, at least until 1945, where a little bit like now, it wasn't so easy to travel. The Bell suddenly discovered Ireland as a place that you could go around. There's lots of essays about what I did in the summer. We've got photographs of people walking around and, you know, looking at the West Coast, looking at Donegal, looking at Kilkenny. So a little bit like at the moment, there's a rediscovery of the island, precisely because people couldn't go anywhere else. It would be a parochial Ireland if it was bound by its own shores. And think about this now, from 1946 until the turn of the 21st century, think about all those writers who agree with O'Fwylon in the sense that they go to the coast and they look out, and we're going to go through a list of them now, and they imagine other places. Peter? Because to not do that was to face this problem that John Hewitt, a poet I have different thoughts about, and I'd be happy to talk with you about John Hewitt afterwards. But I think this is a great acute poem of the problem of partition, I would suggest. It might even, if I could stretch it a little bit further, be a great poem of the insularity of the North, when the North is understood only as a place apart. Just that great line there, when the tide ebbed, we're left stranded here in crevices and ledge-protected pools that have grown salter with the drying up of the great common flow that kept us sweet. You can hear the echoes of the great 19th and 20th century language of the English-British labour movements there. The idea of the common flow, the green and pleasant valleys, or the idea of the sweetness of cooperation. And you get brilliantly that idea of the bitterness of his version of the North. As a child, I used to love going around the rock pools in Donegal, and you know the ones which are further away, the ones which are only replaced at high tide, that yellowness around the edge, the acidity of the water, nothing in it, the brackishness. And this is, I think, how early on even Hewitt is imagining the north of Ireland as a separate state, as a place that only says no, a drying up of the great common flow that kept us sweet. Next, Peter, please. So over and over again in magazines, people thought over the 20th century of different ways. And, you know, if you're looking for a subject of study or even a subject of distraction, but certainly if you're in the MA in Irish Studies at the moment, the little magazines are still so relatively undiscovered. I was amazed to come across in Trinity this magazine called Atlantis, which has really been, I'm not sure, been studied at all very much. I'd be happy to be corrected. But it was edited, amongst other people, by Seamus Dean. And March 1970, the first number, it's really a trial run for what became Field Day. And if you think about where Field Day really came from too, which is the College of the University of Ulster up at Magee, that there is a northern coastline to all of this imagination of what a fifth province could be, another imaginary Ireland that Field Day set itself to imagine, more famously afterwards. But you can see that cover and that wonderful declension there of the land falling into the sea at the start. And you can see that the watery intent of this is to rethink Ireland, to rethink the North in this archipelagic context. Next, please. That's quite an editorial board. Seamus Dean, Derek Mahan, God rest him, we miss him, a wonderful man. I was sorry of his passing. Hugh Maxton, of course, the pen name, Augustine Martin, Michael Gill. It's such a weird editorial board. You think about Gus Martin with Derek Mahan and Seamus Dean, but there you are. And then you have that wonderful list there of the patrons. Austin Clarke, Dennis Donohue's in there, Seamus Dean is in there, Seamus Heaney is in there, Nuala O'Fwylon is in there. It's a really fascinating magazine to show that there are these communities of conversation of people in the later 20th century who are thinking in this archipelagic, island, coastal, liquid sense. Next, please. And their aim, as you can hear Seamus speaking through this, I really think Seamus Dean was our great European mind of the 20th century, thinking about decolonisation. They want to see Ireland in an international perspective, to lift its drowsy eyelid and disturb it into a sense of relationship and awareness. And of course, something we could talk about afterwards, really what I am talking to you here in this coastal, blue, liquid humanity sense is another version of the relational history of Irish cultural criticism. I always had a concern with the version of the post-colonial as imagined in Ireland, in that it seemed to me to still relate very strongly to national histories. And we can talk about that after. You can argue with me. I'm happy to be educated. But I do think that the coastal and the liquid and the water and the blue help you avoid some of those problems, because you're not thinking from the very first principle about the territorial national history of Ireland, of whichever part. And here you can see again a version of what Hewitt might have called a radical regionalism. We have a depopulated west and a rancid north. Is there any parallel elsewhere which can make these situations more intelligible? So looking for comparisons. So where do we find these comparisons? And interestingly, Seamus Sass here named 6 Irish painters, living or dead. So it is a question of vision. It's a question of being able to see. And I'm going to talk a little bit now in a minute about the idea of seeing and about vision, because I think it's critical to this reimagination of an Ireland offshore. Next, Peter, please. Because if you don't do it, you can either be left high up on the shoreline, as John Hewitt was, or you can be immersed. And one of my favourite lines, from many favourite lines from Paul's Unapproved Road: when we came to the customs post at Auchnacloy, as at Cullaville or Pedigo, I was holding my breath, as if I might yet again be about to go underwater. When you go back and read through the literature, and when you go back through poetry from the north of Ireland through the later 20th century, it's totally fascinating how many images there are of submersion, how many of the images there are of inundation, of water, of being held underwater, of trying to find yourself on some island where you can see things. Isn't that what Station Island is all about? But there's a whole other grammar and lexicon and vocabulary of water that we have yet to think about. Peter? And there is a genealogy of it. You can go right back to the middle of the 20th century to another wonderful literary magazine that if you're a student, you might want to spend some time with. It's available, as you can see here, on the old microfilm machines, which, if you remember telephones, you remember these, edited by David Marcus and Terence Smith. Now, this is Louis MacNeice walking along, thinking about his father, who was dead. It's an elegy. And as Edna Longley long ago pointed out, that many of these poems of the Northern Isles are poems of elegy, of remembrance. And he's thinking about the foam changing. But who's the first person he describes himself to, or at least how is the moment described in context of Tintoretto? About the idea of that liquid blue sky above, of the cobalt, the cloud, the reflection of the water, and then that wonderful bit at the end. You have the kind of the mathematics that goes in the middle, 60 odd years behind him and 12 before, and almost kind of Yeatsian turn there to put order on the past by its numbering. But then you have the idea of the mirror, caught a shape which catches mind, but then is now the floor mop of the foam blotted, the bright reflections, and no sign remains of face or feet when visitors have gone home. So blotted is, you know, a word of erasure. I've not been quite comfortable at that coastal zone. And if you think about perhaps the greatest book of northern discomfort of all is Louis MacNeice's travelogue of I Crossed the Minch, which is perhaps the most miserable account of being outside that's ever been written. You think also about his book Letters to Iceland with W.H. Auden. He's not quite there yet in thinking about the coast as some point of liberation and transformation, but it is there for troubled memory. And next, Peter, please. You've got Seamus Heaney in North, that great invocation. I return to a long strand when I miss home, and forgive me for reading all these poems out, but I imagine we're all speaking in northern accents together here. It's a kind of home for me. But isn't that, I mean, I return to a long strand, a hammered curve of a bay, and find only the secular powers of the Atlantic thundering. Don't you love those poems where you can hear the ocean and the sea? The thing described is there in the rumble of the words. And that curvature, I think, is important too, because so many of these poems of the north of the archipelago are about these arcs of association, of bent lines. And I think bent lines are things that don't go with nation states, with territoriality, with solid formations. And they're also poems about light. Lie down in the word hoard, burrow the coil and gleam of your furrowed brain, compose in darkness, expect aurora borealis in the long foray, but no cascade of light. I have always loved that poem, but that beautiful, imagine that description of life, because it's challenged, it's complicated, but you get that idea of motion and travel, the long foray. There isn't going to be any moment of enlightenment. George Russell is not now going to appear in this Microsoft Teams call and tell us all what the secret of the universe is. There is no theosophical key. Madame Blavatsky, who McNeice was so skeptical of, cannot save us. But what you might get somehow is through this northern weather, this frequency, this green light in the sky, this suggestion of another time and place beyond the one that we're in. And think how important that is in a time of trouble. And we come to the end and we get to Anna Burns. I want you to think about that whenever we're reading that wonderful passage when they're in French class and they look out the window to see the sunset. Peter, please. You have it too here in Maeve McGuckian. I love these lines. And also they're lines that, would you say that they are resistant to a certain kind of linear meaning too? The gender history of these texts is critical too. The idea of a language which cannot be captured. But if we are thinking along those lines, and if you wanted to think of it even beyond the north and think of a book like The Gathering by Anne Enright, think about it's always the coastline that these moments go to. It's always looking up at the light. It's always looking up at the weather. It's even there if you think about it in poor Evan Boland, thinking about the River Liffey and the Anna Livia poems. It's there in the water. And those great lines at the end here, but staring at the old escape and release of the water's speech, faithless to the end, your voice was the longest I held in my mind, although I had forgotten there could be such thing. So you get these moments of aperture, these moments of enlightenment, but they're faithless, they're blotted, can't be possessed. And so the important thing about all of this, perhaps also archipelagic northern literature, is that it's a condition. I could do with a soundtrack, but maybe not that one. So they are a condition of mind. So think about this also, and this is perhaps something that the historians will get aggravated by. What the works of literature are doing here are creating conditions. They're creating moments of insight. What you see is still yet to be described. It has not come into shape. This is not, as those earlier maps were, a cartography of what should be. These are moments of possibility, windows into the future. And you only get to them when you get to the edge. And think about how many of these characters, think of it in Heaney, exposure. It's always when you're furthest out. Think about it in the Sweeney poems. It's always when you're at the end of your mental resources, of your physical resources. When you're at your most marginal, that is whenever you begin to see this world break down. You can see its historical background, of course, but you can also perhaps see its visionary future. And next one, please, Peter. And so again, and again, and again, you get the idea of vision and of disappearance. And wonderfully here, and if you've read Sinead Morrissey's brilliant collection on balance and her great poem, The Millahellen, which I don't have here, but about the idea of launching as ships, that what you can see, what was here in the morning has gone, fair head, Rathlin. We stepped out on the deck of a ship. It's a really fascinating way to think about what's going on at the moment too. When you think about what argument there is about where one nation begins and another ends, about where one union begins and another ends. And to think that, you know, there is a resource, I think, over the last 50 and more years in the poetry, in the literature, of finding ways to describe these in-between conditions that aren't to do with conflict, that aren't to do with possession, which aren't to do with hegemony, which aren't to do with domination of one side or another, but are about being there in the moment together and seeing things through the hill back streets. Peter, please. And you know, we're going to move to the end now. I'm going to talk a little bit about Archipelago and then end up with a little bit of Kieran and a little bit Anna Burns, so I won't be talking for too much longer. But when you're thinking about going off and looking up Tintoretto, looking up at the sky there for the meteor shower in Sinead's poem, the angle of vision is also important. So your seaward look is not always here looking straight out. In so many of these poems, it's about the idea of looking up. And so there is a whole sort of, how would you say, geometry of this apparition of the archipelago, which comes out over and over again. And there's a great example of it in this cover of the magazine Archipelago, and I've been involved with Fiona Stafford in doing a kind of a reader, an anthology from this magazine, which ran for 12 issues. Shimasini was one of the earliest people to support it. But think here, look at that angle of the islands of Ireland and Britain there from there. It's not somewhere you normally think of. You can see the northern coast of France there, which is now coming back in as such a point of connection with Ireland. You see the gannets, you see the fish at the bottom. That there are ways to tilt this globe. Paul Muldoon does this so much in his poems about North America. We're beginning to see its historical, its transoceanic, its maritime relations differently. Next, Peter. And a reminder, Peter Davidson writes so brilliantly about the North, that these questions of light and looking up are also always questions of geography and of distance. And he follows here in this beautiful essay that he wrote, The Latitudes of Twilight, the way in which the appearance of light in these different degrees of latitude north mean entirely different things. Newcastle, Scottish border, London, the very far northern Isles of Scotland. Those things are also true in Ireland. I'm always amused when I go home in the summer. My wife is from Cork. We'll be in Cork. I'll call home to my parents in the north. And the difference, not just in the weather, but in the latitude of light, is something that you notice. So while unions and political unions and national histories tend to create common concerns, the observation of nature, the observation of light, the observation of atmospheric condition is something that is important, and is a kind of an undoing, I think, of these other sorts of national possession. And we're going to get that with Kieran in a minute. Next, please. A version of this, of course, you can see if any of you have looked at the artwork of Norman Ackroyd. I won't linger on this too long, but this is a print. You can go on NORMANACKROYD. This is of a trip that he did with Robert Macfarlane, the great nature writer and great friend of Tim Robinson's, out to Tory Island. But keep that light in your head. And next, Peter. Robert thinking about going out to Tory. Out on the island on a clear day, you recognise John Berger's description of the light on the Irish west coast as a weir pouring over the edge of Europe. To sail the Tory is therefore to journey towards the light, and in this way might be said to resemble death. Peter. Now you could say, of course, that perhaps the history of the north of Ireland in the later 20th century was itself a deathly history, a grim one ridden with unnecessary suffering and mortality, the after effects with which we still all live with who were there. And it's really fascinating to see, like those particles of light that Rob Macfarlane talks about, to see that loss distributed through this northern archipelago. You get it here in that beautiful poem of Michael Longley's On the Shetlands, where he's thinking about McDermott's poem On a Raised Beach. He talks about the Pegasus, this idea of the winged horse, which is there in McDermott's poem. McDermott, wild, mad, on the island of Walsey in the Shetlands, writing his own manifestos for the future of a Scotland that has not yet come to being. And Michael looking around, sad news from home, the otters' flashes, and this wonderful issue of scale that Michael returns to so much. I talked about at the start a little bit with Ulysses and on the grand scale of the epic, thinking about Hoth and Gibraltar. Michael does this archipelagic scalar rendering the different way. He always makes it smaller and more intimate. A grandchild's mount. Shall I come as main? His hoof prints fill with rain and inspire me, my hobbling diminutive Pegasus. There is a history of the North at large in these lines, a quiet history. I'm not going to say it's a hidden history, but perhaps it's a layered one. And it's only in thinking about these archipelagic transactions, in these motions, in these cultural histories of light and water, that you begin to realise the depth of this journey between the Toft and Yell ferry. Peter? And just to take you to the last 3 slides. If I was to say to you at the end of all of this to read a book that did everything I've talked to you about in the most advanced, aesthetic, gifted, brilliant, artistic way, I would say read Kieran Carson's The Star Factory. I come back to this book all the time. It's so brilliant about language. It's so brilliant about memory. It's so touching. But it seems to me, if there was a book that ever spoke to me, well, there were 2 really, and the 2 I'm going to finish with, about Belfast, and what this sleechy, stilted, deep, complicated, material, imperial, linguistic, transnational, flooded, tidal. History of Belfast might be, it would be in the Star Factory. And think about it, stars, haven't we been invited to look up all the time through these poems, would be that book. And I once had a Queen's historian give out to me for reading from my slides, but I'm a literature professor and we should read literature aloud. So bear with me, 3 more, I want to read this. And I want you to think about this poem that he quotes from, Wordsworth. Wordsworth's poem of Westminster Bridge, written 1802, at a moment of truce in the Napoleonic Wars, the Star Factory, thinking about 1996 and 1998. I have to admit, I love this bridge. Driving in its flyover, and this of course is the bridge that they built, which goes across the Lagan, joins the city. I never have loved it myself. I think it kind of cuts off the harbour and the mouth, but Kieran, of course, with his brilliance, sees it as something else, admiring the stylized white lines printed on the clean black tarmac. And of course, Kieran was also a great man for taking the mick too, so I always feel a kind of slightly wry and sardonic in this too. I feel I'm taking off from an aircraft carrier in 1996. I soar on a gradual aerial curve above the harbour and the docks, seeing them in a new sunlit perspective. Soaring, Daedalus, when you're by the coast and you have the condition of lift, you have approached a different aesthetic rendering of the place that you were leaving behind, that you were seeing from a different perspective, and you're able to change it into something else. So here we have Belfast. Who would ever have thought crossing the Lagan? Now, this is a little bit like Wordsworth's poem on Westminster Bridge. But it's not just the brilliance of Kieran's individual imagination. It has a historicisable, culturally relatable, genealogical turn in the older poetry about Archipelago, about being at the coast and in the north. Earth has not anything to show more fair. This is the Lagan I grew up with shopping trolleys in it. Dull would he be of soul who could pass by a sight so touching in its majesty. Kieran, really? The city now doth like a garment wear the beauty of the morning. Well, okay, sometimes getting the bus to school, perhaps once or twice. Silent bare ships, towers, domes, theatres and temples lie open onto the fields and to the sky, all bright and glittering in the smokeless air. Well, I'm old enough to have grown up in a very smoked air in Belfast, but the gesture here is towards peace. The translation of Belfast by the river into another city by the river is not just a simple connection between Carson and Wordsworth, Belfast and London, but a sharing of conditions of visionary transmutation that the understanding of the atmosphere and water allows. And that transmutation is from war to peace. Peace is not, however, settlement. Peace is a condition of seeing. It's an active process. It is ongoing. And let me finish now with the most brilliant example of that I have ever yet read, which is in Anna Burns' Milkman. If you haven't read Anna Burns' Milkman, you really should read Anna Burns' Milkman. It is one of the very few books I have ever read where I thought that's true, but I only know it to be true because I only ever felt that. I never put it into words before. It's a book of the back of the head. It is a book of the collective unconscious. It's the most magical translation. I wish Anna were here today that I could tell her how much I love this book. So they're here at French class. I think this is being beside the tech in Belfast, beside Inst. I used to wonder what was going on in there all the time. Of course, that was opened, I think, by Horace Plunkett. Peter, and we think about agricultural reformers and education in the north. I'm going to stop, but I want you to think about this. The kids, the students, are there in their class. They're looking out the window, and their French teacher says, you know, there's more than one colour in the sky. I mean, it's not all just blue. Look out, and they're all going, there's only blue, there's only blue. And they have this kind of argument. Come, she persisted, why have you turned your backs? It's a great double line too, isn't it? For we had turned our backs. It had been instinctive and protective. Maybe we all turned our backs. But she made us turn round to face the sky once more. This time she proceeded to point through various panes at sections of sky that were not blue, but instead lilac, purple, patches of pink, differing pinks, with one patch of green that had a yellow gold extending along it, and green. How come green was up there? And next, Peter. And forgive me for this, but I don't get to swear very often in my honest accent here, so we'll put this aside for my American readers as a piece of Belfast vernacular. So I nodded at the sunset, at this horizon, which made no sense. with all these odd people also gazing upon the sunset around me. And it was that moment just as I was thinking, what the fuck are they, that something out there or something in me then changed. It fell into place because now, instead of blue, blue and more blue, the official blue everybody understood and thought was up there, the truth hit my senses. It became clear as I gazed that there was no blue out there at all. For the first time, I saw colours. Just as a week later in his French class also was I seeing colours. On both occasions, these colours were blending and mixing, sliding and extending, new colours arriving, all colours combining, as it should be. Thank you all. I'm glad you're all still here. Now, I can't see chat, but if you'd like to unmute yourself and ask me a question, I'd be happy to. Or Peter, please.
Nicholas, can you hear me?
I can.
Great. Okay.
Yeah.
Thank you so much for that phenomenal paper, an extraordinary paper. I think it's been a tremendous pleasure for all of us to hear it this afternoon. I'm sure it will give rise to many questions. We have quite a few people, as I said, here in the call. So if you'd like to ask a question of Nicholas, on your screen you should see a little hand icon, probably towards the top of your screen. If you just want to press that, that will just alert me to you wanting to ask a question, and I'll invite you to unmute and put your question to Nick. So who would like to start?
If I don't like your question, I'll just pretend I can't hear you.
Okay, have we got anyone wanting to start?
Jamie Nugent has a question.
Okay, go ahead, Jamie.
Hi, Nicholas. Can you hear me?
Yes, Jimmy. Nice to see you.
You can't get out of my question now. I'm doing my research into the history of tourism in 20th century Northern Ireland, and I've always been struck by, tourism as a place of liminality, a place where sort of unexpected things happen, especially since so much of it is based at watery places, Locher and the Antrim coast. So I wonder if that has ever entered into your mind, in that the official encouragement of tourism is almost in a way helping people to imagine a world beyond the one that they usually encounter, especially when their knowledge that they come from the city and they go out to someplace different to experience different things. I wonder what you thought of that.
Yeah, it's a great question, and actually we have a great scholar here of tourism and travel, Tim Hannigan. I can see if he wants to pop in a minute, but the only addition I would say to that is that there can also be, through the functions of the state and its bureaucracies, the regulation of travel on approved routes, through the practice of tourism, and of course they often follow infrastructures of the state, of railways, of roads, of perhaps even boating routes. So it would be totally, I think, actually a really great test case of the limits of this argument either way would be to have a study of what happens in Lough Erne and those kind of watery borderlands of Fermanagh, which we haven't really written about or thought about enough, as a way of showing, where one state ends, another happens, or is it different on water? And I write a little bit about a man called Robert Gibbs in my book. He was from Cork, but he wrote a lot of travelogues about going down rivers, and it's definitely a question there of finding the river and of finding the license and freedom, but not in an approved travel setting. So I think there's something different between wandering, traveling, and following a tourist itinerary without being pointed to one place or another. Tim, I don't know, do you want to say anything briefly?
Hello, yes. That's a great question, but it just sort of, I had a question of my own formulated, which was very tangential to that, based off some writing I was doing last week about another place entirely. But I would just like to ask you a follow-on question from that, in the framework of tourism, about the idea of water as a symbolic entry point. The context is last week I was writing about Cornwall, which is my home place. and the way it gradually contracted into a fixed territory, and the river Tamar, became the symbolic entry point for tourism. It's a watery space. It had no political significance for a very long time, but then it was created as one. So it was an idea that was coming out of all of that liminality. Does water function as a symbolic entry point for North or the North or wherever it is in tourism terms?
Yeah. Well, I suppose the other thing to think about is there's so many literary forms of tourism. We think about Auden and McNeice. We think about all those travelogues in which like writers have these gigs to go off and write about these places and create kind of literary versions of them. Even if you've been watching the Durrells on television, that's also to do with that kind of imagination of elsewhere being created to the literary text. So there's no single answer to this, but maybe one just to throw it back on you a little bit, or one thing to think about. Whenever the history now of the centenary of the formation of Northern Ireland, of partition in a way, and you think of Seamus Heaney as being proposed as one of the salutary literary figures of Northern Ireland, and think about the idea of desiccation, about the way in which to be made to belong, in a way that poetry and reputation has to be dried out, that all of those travels elsewhere are removed of their transnational contexts. I think you can, if you looked at how Heaney is represented in state-sponsored literature in the next year, I think you could have part of an answer about this conversation. And then one other thing to think about, just in your question about travel. Seamus Heaney's great poem, Remembering Malibu, which is about that other really brilliant Belfast writer that I've never written about enough, Brian Moore, and the idea of Brian Moore's footprints in the sand on the west coast in California, and how alien Heaney found that warm, generous climate compared to the one he was used to. That there are lots of these crossings and transitions, and tourism definitely fits within this wider vocabulary of coming and going that water allows you to think about. It's also down John McGahern a lot too.
Okay, thanks. Do we have other questions? If I'm not seeing your hand come up, just perhaps shout out.
I did have my own question.
Yeah, go ahead.
My own question, which I hadn't asked there. It was again relating to things I was working on last week, and it was that line from the John Hewitt poem, "When the tide ebbed, we were left stranded here." And I'd been thinking about something, again, about Cornwall and Wales, actually, but in the complete opposite. The idea of a tide coming in and pinning those places into the west. And I just wondered, it reversed the way I'd been thinking about it. I'd been thinking of an Anglo-Saxon tide coming in and creating those two places. So I just wondered if you could unpick that line about the ebb of the tide from the Hewitt poem a bit more.
Yeah, well, it's an odd one because, of course, you're imagining that things come in and go out, and there is an attempt or a temptation of this to think about history as being repetitive, as being cyclical, as being according to the moon. This is very much there in the Yeatsian tradition. It might also be there in someone like Matthew Arnold, which is the kind of text that hovers in the background so much. So it's not only that some of these accounts of the northern seas have other seas written through them, whether they're Odyssean Mediterraneans or whether they're channels from the 19th century, whether that's in Wordsworth or whether it's in Matthew Arnold. And in a way, I suppose what you're playing with is the idea that we are stuck now at this low point or this high point, depending on where you understand it, that we're going to watch transition happen. This is very much there in the late Yeats poem. And always involved in that idea of being trying to map and count and coordinate where you are is an idea in the poetry of imagining what is going to come next. They present themselves as being historical poems of counting of the past, but they are predicative and they're often reactionary in that sense. And there might be a hidden reactionary history, I'll get killed for saying this, to some of the poetry of John Hewitt. I sometimes get that sense from it in context of the North. So that's how I would say that the ebb and flow, it's not in and out, it's a dimensional, historical, temporal, spatial question. Tim D has a beautiful way of describing it. A tide coming in is the only way that you can see gravity working in reverse.
Thank you.
Thanks, Tim.
Lisa Godson, did she have a question?
There's Michael, then Mackenzie, then Lisa.
Okay.
Thanks. Or does someone want to go ahead? Sorry.
Lisa, go ahead.
Yeah. Thanks very much for an amazing talk. I don't want to sound silly, but Do you ever think of other forms of water, like the water that comes out of the taps and is part of infrastructure?
Yeah.
And how that kind of maybe connects us as well.
Yeah, no, absolutely. So, there's a really great book about Irish infrastructure called Public Works.
Yeah, I know. Yeah.
And there's a lot being written in Joyce about taps and about plumbing, and often kind of the joke, it's almost like that Monty Python sketch, what did the Romans ever do for us? And then they go through the declension of these public works. And Anne-Marie Darcy, who I talked about at the start, has a great essay about Joyce and the Bartrey water scheme. So absolutely. And, and I'm sure I see Professor Conley coming in and out there, and I know Peter does such great work with the students. I'm sure in Belfast, some of that work on water schemes and waterworks. And just as one little analogy, like you think of, I've seen a lot about Milkman, and it's a roundabout way of answering the question. She never goes to the sea. Like Belfast Lough is not there, like the water in except for the one place, it's the waterworks. Yeah. And that's the place that she runs around and she goes back to. So there's definitely something in that kind of Kieran Carson, Anna Burns declension of infrastructure that exactly has to do with that built delivery of water through systems.
Yeah, great. Thanks very much.
Nice to see you.
Thanks, Lisa. Michael, you're next.
Sorry, I'm trying to get on screen. Hello, Nicholas. Thanks for a great talk. I really enjoyed it. I'm from Lurgan, would you believe? One of the officers in the Lurgan George Russell Society. So delighted to see the picture of on your wall, and of course we've all read your excellent biography of Russell. Look forward to reading some of your other books as well. Just one question: in all this reflection on water, are you really offering a very gentle, subtle political prescription, basically that we all must come together? Because after all, we're all just creatures and organisms that emerge from the same pond.
Yeah, well, I would say, and actually wanted to go back to Russell. There's a bit, if you're ever in a library, if you write to me afterwards, I'll send you a photocopy, but you might enjoy the Heaney chapter. There's a lot about Lough Neagh and about the inland waters of Ireland there that, might speak to you as a Lurgan man. But I would suppose there is in the north, and I was just talking with Peter about this. He's writing a book about William Sharman Crawford, which I look forward to. But there is a radical tradition of social cooperation, which if you only thought about the later 20th century, you mightn't be so aware of. It was there very much in Russell's ideas of fraternity and sorority, of universal brotherhood. It's there very much in many of the agrarian movements of the north of Ireland. Now, they're all complicated. They have different edges. They have different contexts. They're not all the same thing. But I do think that absolutely in thinking about water and its declensions, about its changing states, and I call in my book Heaney a poet of changing states, and it's kind of a pun about changing states of water, but also changing states of association, that there is an invitation, and I'm glad for the first time in my life that someone's ever called me subtle, an invitation to think about modes of transformation that are not bound by the material, the hard and the iron, but might be conditional, that might be temporal, and that might look different from different times and points of view. So it is a kind of an unmooring in that way, absolutely. But I suppose the only thing I would add to that, Michael, is that it's still always historicizable. So it's not ever pretending that it's an escape from something. It's just a different way of imagining our particulate relationships with each other.
Okay, thanks.
Nice to see you. Thank you for being here too.
Thank you, Michael. Do we have other hands?
Yes.
Shout out, please, if I can't see them on my screen. I don't see everything. Go ahead.
Mackenzie, and then Lily, and then Fran.
Okay. Thanks, Philip.
Fran, be nice.
Hi. Thank you. That was a lovely talk. My question might be a little too morbid for a Monday, but and you alluded to it a few times, but I wanted to hear more about your thoughts about water and death specifically. I'm thinking about the new book out from Syracuse on literary drownings and connecting Ireland through Caribbean mindsets and the transatlantic through literary drownings. And I'm also thinking of a theme I'm seeing with women poets and drowning as a place of freedom from a post-colonial masculine landscape. And I'm wondering if any of that is apparent to you, or if that's something that you've been thinking about.
Well, if you wrote to me afterwards, I'd be happy to point you to Edna Longley's essay, which she wrote about islands in the north and about morbidity and death, which is really a great essay. And I've joked with Edna before that really what I'm saying here is Edna Longley for slow learners. But absolutely, and totally, a great place to go, and it would continue. And I see Fran is here. Perhaps Fran has some suggestions as well. The connection with the Caribbean and transnational context, but certainly Late Heaney that I've been obsessing about a bit in Human Chain, and also his version of the Aeneid, that you really get a version of the Derry countryside and the riverside of the riverbank field as a place of mortality and of transition. I think it's fairly well established that many of these poems are about death of the Northern Islands and the Northern coastal journey. I haven't read that book about literary drowning, so thank you very much. I will go and check that out. But you could extend it far beyond the north. I mentioned a little bit about Anne Enright's The Gathering, and I think that fits very well in this idea of drowning and extinction. Your question as to whether it's specific of a women's writing, and that's a really great question, actually, and something I need to think about more. I thought about it mostly in context of Heaney, but about Enright. I hadn't thought of it as a gendered condition of writing specifically now in this moment. But if you've thought about that, I'd love to hear you. Tell me.
Very new thoughts. I've just thinking of Doreen Negrifa, a poem from, I think it's 9 Silences, where the woman is dying into the water and dying away from forced marriage and conditions of abortion, and that becomes a metaphor for freedom away from some of these restrictions of female life.
Yeah, thank you. And I've ordered, I know Doreen, I've ordered a book. It's just its tome and I haven't got to read it yet. But you could extend that even further if you think into the short stories like of William Trevor. And I allude to it in the book, though I don't really go into it very much, but about that history of transit between Ireland and England and Wales, about the control of the state over women's bodies. And that's definitely a history that needs to be excavated more and represented more in this conversation. And William Trevor, I would think of one place to start, but thank you.
Okay, thanks. Fran?
Hi, can you hear me okay?
You keeping well?
I'm not too bad. I'm sorry, I have a child making a terrible racket in the other room. I've been thinking about birds and sea in a completely different context, and I just wondered if you had a thought. It's quite a minor point on one of the Derek Mahon rewrites that I sort of don't mind as much as the others, which is the Recalling Aaron one, where he changes 4,000 miles away tonight to Atlantic leagues away tonight, and whether you thought there was any particular rationale behind the shift. I don't whether Atlantic is taking on a kind of currency, because it's in the first book. It's like a 68 poem. It's really early, and then he shifts it in the 70s.
Actually, I'd love to talk with you about birds. Do you know that book? Is it Birds of the Grey Waste? It's called. It's sort of a 1940s or 50s account of birds. I'll send it to you afterwards, Fran. I think you'd love it.
Brilliant, thanks. Yeah, I'm on kind of Longley birds, and I'm the least observant person of the natural world in the history of people. Well, so I'm struggling a little bit, because I look at a bird and go, look, there's a bird, and Michael Longley looks and says, oh, look, there are 7, whatever,
But what we should write afterwards is lots of great stuff. But, I love the idea. One other way to think about these northern transits birds, absolutely, it's so much there in the poetry.
It's in the Mahon Canadian Pacific one is the one I was thinking about, but it made me think then of the change to just the Atlantic kind of terminology. But
because there's a whole ecology to this landscape, or this hydroscape, that we should think about. And the idea of the Atlantic, yes. One of the slides I took up, because I already had too many, and forgive me for speaking so long today, was in the Star Factory, Kieran talks about, I felt the chill of his Atlantic language. And you could write a book on the motivation and position and use of the word Atlantic in these texts. We take it to mean one sort of body of water, but there's a coldness, a depth, a variety, and a history to it, going back to that Hester Bloom quotation that we could all do with thinking about a little bit more. I mean, even whenever I first came to work in America, I was in Chapel Hill in North Carolina, and one of my much older, lovely colleague said to me, "Oh, I've been in Ireland," and I was like, "Okay, I'm going to hear a story now about golf." But actually, he had been in Derry in a listening station in the North Atlantic, listening for Russian submarines. And so there are all of these deep Atlantic histories, some human and machine, definitely birds, fish, of course, in recent contexts are another thing to think about. But yeah, I'll write to you, and I'd love to read what you're doing. It's nice to see you as well. And
Yeah, you too.
You're noisy.
Yeah, really enjoyed it.
There's still Lillian and Glenn. There's a few hands still up, whether they're ghost hands or hands to speak again, I don't know. But Lillian, then Glenn.
Thanks, Philip.
This is like being, I remember when I was a kid, I used to get taken out to the shopping centre in Newton Ards, and you get lost, and then you'd hear the voice going, "Would the children of George and Anne Allen please report?" And it's like having Philip call over as the supermarket call. Lillian, sorry.
Hi, can you hear me?
Yep. Nice to see you. How are you?
Hi, nice to see you, and nice to actually get to speak to you. And greetings from Oxford. I'm sorry to be that person, but I was just wondering about the situation of the border with Brexit in the sea, and how, even though often in England it's posed as like the sea kind of it being a border, that actually there's a conversation about how that might have also unifying kind of ramifications for the island of Ireland. And have you had many thoughts about that?
I have many thoughts. So it's probably best if I don't share them all. But have you read, Lynn, Garrett Carr's great book, The Lie of the Land?
I haven't actually.
Well, you would love it, because actually he follows the border from the sea, but through rivers and caches and marshes and bogs, and he's really brilliant in his canoe or by foot about how impossible the border is when you think about it in terms of water. And that was some time ago. And to go back even to the earlier comment about the idea of cooperation and community and a kind of liquidity, I think accepting that things are in flow, which is hard for the legal jurisdiction of nation states, is a way of compromise. And I think ever since the Good Friday Agreement, the fact that you could live in that layered north of Ireland, that you could be Irish or British or Irish and British or European and British and Irish or none of those things, that you had these sort of ghost countries led over each other, that this drawing of definite imaginary lines is a kind of work of violence to me in itself, and certainly a work of exclusion. Since we're at Queen's, I won't speak of United Ireland, but one thing I do think about all this, something to watch. I am not in any way a prophet, but just of observation. I do wonder, with the UK having gone out of the European Union, will a Scotland leaving the UK be the thing that takes the logic away from a United Kingdom? I can't imagine what you'd be a unionist for if Scotland was no longer a part of that union, but of another. And maybe the future Irish unionists will be European unionists. But I do wonder if a Scotland left is a kind of... and also you need to think also, what does United Ireland mean? I mean, is it an island of Ireland that in spite of borders can live peaceably? That there is mutability, that there is acceptance, that there is respect, that there is proper tolerance. I actually think of a civic project for the next 50 years, and that even were there to be a border pull, I mean, I would very much like there to be no border in Ireland. My own personal position, but any preparation for such a transition needs deep civic work, such as happens in the university over many decades. And I wouldn't have these opinions had I not gone to university and had the opportunity to think and learn and change.
Thank you very much.
Thanks, Lillian. I think we have Glenn next.
Yeah, can you see me?
I can hear you. Oh, hello.
Yeah.
Yes. How are you?
Hi, Nicholas. Thank you for the talk. I wonder, have you thought at all about the relationship between archipelagic thinking and the Anthropocene?
Yeah, that's fine. Yeah. And it's really interesting that Andrew McNeely, who I keep up with, who edited Archipelago, the magazine, is now thinking of a magazine called 13, and that Orwellian idea of the clock striking 13, that it's already sort of past time. I think in the way that the kind of carbon and energy histories of nation states and of the histories of imperial extraction and the idea of environmental abuse are things that can be reconfigured by thinking about coastal connections. And I think also to go back to Fran's idea of seeing other sentience, of the appreciation of other beings, the other than human, the more than human, the beside the human, that the archipelagic is a way, because of its description of human presence, often at extremity, of seeing these other things and having to consider what your relationship with other things are. They would be my main thoughts. Do you have better?
Well, no, there's a bit of a turn at the minute within island studies towards the Anthropocene. There's a number of key texts coming out. One, actually, I'll just give you as a reference you might be interested in. It's just called Contemporary Archipelagic Thinking, and it mostly reflects on the Caribbean poets and writers, Edward Glissant and Camus Braithwaite, and looking at how he's thinking is precisely a way to think differently about climate change, in terms of connectivity, but also how islands themselves are kind of becoming emblematic, or almost allegories of the Anthropocene in many ways. So there is an engagement with islands through climate change.
So, Glenn, actually, would you write to me afterwards? We have it's funny that I have this sort of bifurcated life here. I have my own kind of partitioned mind, but one of the big research projects we do, I'm part of a coastal consortium here where, in fact, we look at the coast of the American Southeast and environmental justice projects at the community level about what it means to be beside the sea. So I do think about these things with that half of my head. And I haven't thought about them quite so much in the Irish context so much, but there's a really wonderful sea island chain with a very complex and rich and challenged history here around Sapelo Island, Sea Islands of Georgia. And we have this research project with the Penn Center, which is connected to the old Gullah Geechee communities. And you should write to me. I'd love to talk with you about that, because that's exactly where that will do.
Thanks.
Nice to see you. Thank you.
I see that Stephen O'Neill has his hand up. Could that only be Stephen O'Neill, I wonder?
Is he going to ask me about roads?
Or Celtic?
I'm not going to ask about Celtic for a while anyway. Can you hear me, Nicholas? Sorry.
Are you going to ask me a question about roads by the sea?
I was going to ask you a question actually about Stormont and Britannia.
Okay.
But so I thought about part of the problem maybe both today and yesterday, and thinking about conversations that are happening on a wider scale as well about Ireland's involvement with empire and colonialism. I mean, the reason why I'm talking about Britannia is, of course, it's top Stormont. And whether it's waving the rules or rooting the waves, it's obviously about the sea. And how much of the narrative, I mean, history in the North, you talked about national histories and that, how much of it is kind of shaped and conditioned by colonialism and mercantile sort of things, and also by an empire which is about the waves. And sort of, I was thinking about John Hughes isn't in his work, and how much that we don't really find. We don't even like look at novelists like, say, St. John Irvine, who celebrate this connection as well. And I just wondered, I mean, what your thoughts on that? It's a very bad question, but
no, it's a great question. And actually I have several thoughts, as you would imagine. I'll try to say them briefly. But one thing I would say, I've talked about water, but if you were looking for reaction, I would point you to desiccation. You often find in the early to mid-century poetry that whenever things are beginning to dry out, they're at their worst. If you think about Yeats's The Second Coming, that's an example of it. You also have that parchedness of Hewitt and the inward turn, I think, is a kind of self-partitioned reality. So there's definitely a line between dryness, landedness, and a turning the back on complication of wanting to confirm that which you know as being the state of given things. There's really, and it's also really fascinating to think about the partitioned histories of Ireland in context of imperial experience of the 20th century. I mean, the watery history of Ulster, of the province of Ulster, I mean, goes back millennia from its very foundation. But the representation of watery history, its overlap, its kind of sedimental reality in Kieran Carson is very different than its such representations of the imperial past in Joyce. Now, I know there's a large chronological gap between there, but I think there's also actually something different than looking at these things in Belfast, looking at them in Dublin. But the analogy might not only be to do with borders. You might find in St. John Irving connections to writers in Galway, in Waterford, in Limerick, in Cork, and these other watery places of the south, of Donegal. I mean, even if you go back into a novel like John Sherman, one of the apparitions that the character has is Yeats's earliest novel, going around from the west coast of Ireland to London, is going past Rathlin, is going past the Northern Isles. So, you know, that imperial history is, of course, complicated. I need hardly say that. It's right there in the built fabric of Belfast. You walk past the city hall, you still have these memorials to lost sailors and magnates of far-flung places. But there might be an all-Ireland remedy to that, which is to look at cities connected by the sea through trade and migration to other places, Scotland. Edna Longley used to speak very convincingly of that linen triangle. You think about Manchester, Glasgow, and Belfast, that it's there. But one last thing to say, that you can see this in a way through the Star Factory in a way that you can't, I think, through literature in Dublin in the later 20th century. And I think that one of the conversations I have in the book is the way in which the sea was, if not forgotten. People turned their back on the sea because of the association with imperialism. That's not quite the same true. It has a different function in the Northern poetry. And if I was to point you to a kind of literary analogue of all that, Kieran Carson's HMS, The Ballad of HMS Belfast. I mean, I think that captures all of those complicated textures and makes them psychedelic in a way that disorients them, and if not rob them of their power, makes them again open to other perspectives that you didn't think of before.
Thank you so much. I've written about 4 things by now.
Yeah. Get your hair cut, that's 5. Peter, you're muted.
I think that's it.
You're muted, Peter.
Thanks again. We're running a bit short on time. My digital panopticon is working much less effectively than Philip's. So, Philip, is there anyone you can see who's been waiting to ask a question?
No, I think that's everyone. Yeah.
Well, look, that's great. So that's finished there for this afternoon. It's been an absolutely wonderful session. Nick has got through a paper without being upbraided once by a Queen's historian, which I don't know whether that's a first or not. I'm certainly not going to be the one who does it. I've enjoyed this paper tremendously. I learned a huge amount from it. It's got me sort of thinking along all sorts of channels and estuaries and byways, as I'm sure it has for everyone else who's had the pleasure of listening to you and engaging with you through the questions and answers this afternoon. Can I ask everyone who's still with us maybe just to unmute themselves briefly and give Nick a round of applause in the kind of traditional fashion.
I can see Geraldine clapping.
Last one too.